the experience of having the constant flux of changing sense perceptions left me with a sense that there was nothing solid to hold on to in reality, and so this is not a great, this is not the argument for the existence of God that I would repose in which I would repose great trust. I'm not trying to persuade anyone by this. I'm just telling what my experience was at this point. I later found what I think are very, very persuasive arguments, both philosophically and scientifically. The thing that really convinced me as a university student studying philosophy was an argument known as the argument from epistemological necessity. The fundamental question in modern philosophy that has really just been a stumper and has led to this whole postmodern turn where people don't think there's no objective basis for any reality is the question of the reliability of the human mind. On what basis can we trust the way our minds process all that sensory information? This goes back to Hume and Kant and some of the philosophers in the Enlightenment period.
Hey, stay tuned. I just wanted to let you know that at the end of this video, I'm going to be giving some of my comments and suggestions. And whenever conversations like this come up, I'm going to challenge us to think a little bit more deeper and critically. All right, with that being said, let's keep going.
On what basis can we trust the way our minds process all that sensory information? This goes back to Hume and Kant and some of the philosophers in the Enlightenment period. And from that point forward, there was a great doubt. Maybe we can't trust our minds. Maybe we can't trust. We have all these things we assume about reality in order to make sense about reality. That every cause has an effect, for example. But we can't prove those things. We have to use those assumptions in order to know anything at all. And I encountered this argument that suggested, well, if we try to justify our ability to know the world around us by empirical data, by things we observe, this was Hume's argument. Can't do it. He was a radical empiricist and found that in order to make any sense of the sense impressions he had to presuppose the uniformity of nature. But to prove the uniformity of nature, he had to make reference to sensory observations, and so he was arguing in a circle. And so it came down, you couldn't justify the reliability of assumptions we make in our minds by observing the world. You had to use those assumptions to make sense of the observations. But if you presupposed that our minds were made by a benevolent creator who gave us those assumptions in order to make sense of the world that he also made, then there was a principle of correspondence between the way the mind worked and the way the world worked, in which case we could trust the basic reliability of the mind. And this turns out to be one of the key foundational assumptions that gave rise to modern science. It was called the idea of intelligibility. Newton, Boyle, Kepler, the great founders of modern science, thought that nature had secrets to reveal. There were patterns there to be revealed that we could understand because our minds had been made in the image of the same rational creator who had built rationality and design and pattern and lawful order into the world.
Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in, I believe in microevolution. I believe that there are real evolutionary processes. I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor. I'm profoundly skeptical about chemical evolution, the idea that the non-living chemicals in a prebiotic ocean or prebiotic soup arrange themselves to form the first living cell. And I'm also skeptical about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, which, as it happens, so are many leading evolutionary biologists today. I attended a conference in 2016 convened by the Royal Society in London, Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. And it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with Neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks. And many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution. The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, and he simply enumerated the 5 major what he called explanatory deficits of Neo-Darwinism. And his basic perspective was the mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing forms, it can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms. Think about, for example, the Darwin's finch beaks. Great job of explaining how variations in weather patterns result in changes in the shape and structure of the finch beaks. But that mechanism turns out not to do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or other major animal groups in the first place. So modification, yes. Innovation, no.
But modification over massive amounts of time, don't you think that would eventually lead to new groups? Because a lot of new groups have similar origins, or at least origins from one ancestor.
Well, time,
like primates.
Yeah, time was always the hero of the plot. But let me just run a couple of arguments by you, and let's see what you think. Okay, and I developed these in a lot of detail in my book Darwin's Doubt. If we now know, thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have to have new code, because all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need new anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types. New types. So if you got animals that first come on the line and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food. So enzymes are types of proteins. Proteins are built from the informational code in DNA. So anytime you want to get it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code. So we have these long digital bit strings. A's, C's, G's, and T's, not zeros and ones, but A's, C's, G's, and T's in a digital string, and we call that a gene. And if you have a section of DNA for building a protein, that's great, all works. Now, but if you want to build a fundamentally new form of life, you got to have new proteins to service the new cell types to build the new anatomical structures. In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system. The functional sequences they're highly isolated in what's called sequence space. You can change a few things and still retain function, but after a very few number of changes, you're going to degrade the function, and long before you come up with a new function. Now, the Darwinian mechanism starts with the idea that there are random changes in those digital bit strings, those sequences of A's, C's, G's, and T's. And based on our experience in the computer world, we would expect that random changes are going to, again, degrade those strings long before they're capable of building a new protein.
All right, so one of the first things that I want to do is I want to give a basic definition of what philosophy is. The study of the basic ideas about knowledge, truth, right and wrong, religion, and the nature and meaning of life. I bring this up because scientists also do philosophy. They study, they create theories or probabilities based on what science is trying to explain. And the reason that I bring this up is because we've often heard it said that scientists are bad philosophers. Now, this can be very true whether it be a Christian scientist or an atheist scientist. Sometimes we're just bad at philosophy. But the reason that I bring this up is because in one of my other videos, where I believe it was Richard Dawkins and Piers Morgan having a discussion about the creation of the universe and what was there before. And within this interview, Richard Dawkins says that scientists, they take pride in simply saying that they don't know, and that's a humble stance to take. And within that video, I said also creationists or Christians, they also take pride in simply saying that they don't know as well. And within the comments, there were people reiterating what Richard Dawkins was saying, that scientists don't try and explain anything. They just simply let the data be what the data is. But I find it quite ironic that the very person, that being Richard Dawkins, who is saying this, and the people that are commenting on behalf of Richard Dawkins don't realize that he wrote an entire book to try and debunk the authority of creationism, where he wrote in his 2006 book, The God Delusion. What Dawkins is doing in this book is he's using the same scientific data, suggesting that it points to a lack of God. He's going outside of the science and saying saying this is what the science is pointing to. And when Christians do the same thing, or deists or creationists do the same thing to use this data, to use the same set of data, somehow we're going outside of the realms of science and we're somehow irrelevant, when atheists and agnostics are doing the same thing. We need to identify these blind spots. And another thing that I would say, specifically speaking to the agnostic, where they just simply say, I just let the science be the science and I don't know. Well, what I would say is this conversation is not for you then. If you simply don't know, then you don't know. But let's not act like both sides aren't coming in with some presuppositional ideas about what the evidence might point to. And this is why I say there is a difference between science and philosophy, and it's okay to have some philosophical interpretation of what the data is suggesting. So just to clear it up, it's okay for both sides to say that they don't know, as long as they simply say that we don't know for certain. There are some things that the evidence points to and gives a certain probability of what is more likely versus what is not more likely. And we can also say about certain things that we don't have full understanding about yet, that we just simply don't know. And that's not saying us we know for certain or that we don't know for certain. We all can take the humble approach to say that there's some things that we don't know, and also the evidence does point to this, but you have to go outside of that set of evidence in order to do any set of reasoning or to have any ability to do that reasoning. So I just wanted to simply clear that up, and I think it's a deep and flawed misunderstanding when people just simply say, I let science be science. Okay, then feel free to let science be science, but you don't need to be commenting, I just let science be science, because again, the conversation is not for you. And also realize that you're going outside of science to say that I let science be science. You're using it as a form of debate or argument. So I know we all have blind spots, we all have biases, and I believe this is one that we need to seriously awaken up to. And I know there's more conversation to be had about specifically what we mean by saying I don't know and the difference between philosophy and science, but I just wanted to take the time to simply clear that up. And with that being said, I hope you have a blessed day. Put your faith in Jesus Christ, because he will radically change and transform your life like you could have never imagined. So in the name of Jesus, be blessed.